strength and our Redeemer. Amen. And Jesus said to them, "Peace be with you. As my Father has sent me, so I send you." On May 3rd, 1939, 80 years ago this Friday, Gustav Schroeder, a 37-year veteran of the sea and captain of the SS St. Louis, received word from the German government that his ship was being commissioned for a special voyage. Having repeatedly refused to join the Nazi Party, even under threat, he was immediately suspicious as to why they would choose him for a mission, and yet he accepted. Truth be told, there wasn't much he could do. There would be Nazi officials on board to report back, but he believed in the mission to carry 937 Jewish refugees from Germany to Cuba. He believed that if he accepted the mission, he could keep them safe and ensure their proper treatment. He even gathered the crew together to make sure that that would be the case, to demand that that would be the case. And so over the course of the next week, he began preparing the ship, ignoring a Nazi order that they take off all of the basic necessities of travel, from toilet paper to basic food. Instead, he told his crew to get whatever they needed because these people had been through enough. He only knew the half of it. The members, the passengers of the SS St. Louis, are hidden figures for this month, had all called Germany home. Most of whom had never had a different home. That was their home. Only the virulent policies of the Nazis over the last few years had made it so no longer did they have a place. Imagine living someplace your whole life only to wake up and discover that it is no longer your home. They came from all walks of life. There were doctors and lawyers, teachers and technicians. All of them, women, men, children, singles, couples, families, had seen their world in the last couple of years turned on its head. Some were like Aaron Posner, a Hebrew teacher who in the November before had been taken out of his house during the Kristallnacht, that is, the infamous night of broken glass. He'd been taken to Dachau camp, where he had no connection to the outside world save a photograph of his wife and 2 children, Simon and Ruth. It was taken from him and defiled by one of the guards. Every day he was starving and forced to watch public hangings or drownings or crucifixions, wondering the whole time whether he would be next. Until one day, almost miraculously, surprisingly for sure, he and several others were pulled out of the camp and told that he had his freedom so long as he left Germany within the next 14 days. He was dumped rather unceremoniously at a train station where his wife and 2 kids were waiting for him. They handed him a shabby old suitcase and a travel visa to Cuba, saying that they had sold whatever they had and gotten help from her parents to earn him passage on the St. Louis. All that they asked was that when he got there, he would send for them. Barely able to stand, much less speak, he found himself on the train before he really processed what just happened. And in the moment, suddenly he realized that he wasn't going to get a chance to say goodbye to his family, that maybe he would never see them again. And so he tried to get off the train only to be beaten back by guards for having stepped outside of the Jewish car on the train. When he made it to Hamburg, no sooner had he stepped foot outside of the train station than he was beaten again. Stormtroopers, young men who had just been at a Nazi rally, wanted to show their patriotism. He crawled into an alley next to a slaughterhouse and spent the evening hovering under animal carcasses. The next morning, he found his way onto the ship with trepidation, staring the whole time at that Nazi flag hanging from its mast. Every one of the 937 passengers had their own story. Some were like Aaron's, others were forgotten. There were children sent without their parents. There were couples sent without the other. There were families torn apart. There were professionals who had left everything behind, all in the hope that they could find something else, something hopeful, some kind of life out there. They all brought with them this visa, travel visa that they had purchased for an exorbitant fee that promised to get them into Cuba, and they hoped eventually into the United States. They found their way on board, stepping out in faith, in search of life, praying that someone else in faith might embrace them. As the Father has sent me, so I send you. After tearful goodbyes and a great deal of preparation, on May 13th, 1939, the SS St. Louis set sail for Cuba. A half an hour in, just enough time for those engines to get up to full speed, they received first word that something was not right. The Nazi government set a cable ahead of them to say that maybe they wouldn't have such a warm reception in Cuba, but that they should press on nonetheless so as to get there before the other ships arrived. Captain Schroeder wanted desperately to have the sail go well. He wanted nothing more than for these passengers to get their safety, and he did whatever he could to make them feel welcome on the ship. In fact, so many of the passengers began to comment that it had been years since they had been treated like human beings. He set aside a place on the ship in order to have their Friday evening services. He took down pictures of the Fuhrer. He even created a passenger committee so that he could get their advice about how to welcome them on board. When one of the passengers, an elderly man, died, he worked with the rabbi to prepare the body and to find a way to give a proper at-sea burial for the man, again refusing a direct Nazi order that he drape the body first in a swastika. He wanted it to be a good trip. But for all of his work on the ship, the Nazi propaganda machine was at work off it. Unbeknownst to him or any of the passengers, they had arranged this whole trip and never intended those passengers to find their way to Cuba. They were actively working against that possibility. The captain remembered that he had thrown a photographer off the ship when passengers were embarking. He was taking photographs of the worst-looking passengers, those that had just been released from the concentration camps. They were taking those pictures, but there were enough. They were used inside of Germany to show the Germans just how disgusting and dirty these Jews were, why they needed to leave. Outside of Germany, they were used to show the world the kind of people that were on their way. The undesirables. As we know, a little misinformation goes a long way. And it worked. The people of Cuba and the U.S. and Canada, many of whom were good church-going folk, began to question why they should accept such people. Why should they open their doors to these undesirables? They'd have to live off our systems. Why would we have them come in? And so the ship sailed on, unaware that anything was wrong. Some on board even tried to have fun. Two little girls who had been sent without their parents found a way to get into trouble by playing pranks around the ship. They would wait for the ship to begin rocking in one of those storms, knowing that people would need to use the restroom suddenly, and then they'd go and lock it, the stall door, from the inside and crawl out. They would grease the handles of doors so that waiters and waitresses couldn't get in, eventually dropping their food. There were dances and parties and music and prayers and services, but mostly people longing for new life. And as Cuba came closer, the temperatures rose, so did their hopes. Until finally, that final night, they thought just before they entered Havana Harbor, they threw their final costume party, a celebration for having made it finally to safety. The next morning, they awoke, they dressed as well as they could and packed their bags and waited. And waited. And waited. At first, they thought it was because they landed on a Saturday that they weren't being allowed to disembark, but when Monday came around and they were still on the ship, they were concerned. Captain Schroeder insisted that his passengers be allowed to disembark, but he was told that the port of Havana was closed. When he saw other ships arrive and people start to get off of them, he said, "What gives?" To which they said that the visas these passengers had received were no longer valid, if they ever were. When he, after a week, took a boat himself and found his way into the harbor and, unannounced, marched into the president of Cuba's office demanding that his passengers be allowed to disembark, he was told in no uncertain terms to get his ship out of the harbor or be forced out. Humanitarians got involved with Jewish agencies in the United States, sending representatives to advocate for these poor people. To no avail. They'd begin to make some kind of headway, and then the conversation would change. The money they had agreed upon would not be enough. They would increase it and increase it and increase it, and it was never enough. The international press could see the people on the board and began to take pictures and share them with the world. They began to recognize that these weren't the dirty, disgusting people that they had been made out to be, but just people who were in need. But seeing is believing, friends. And not everyone is willing to see. Family members who had already made it to Cuba began to rent boats to row out into the harbor to be able to see their loved ones from the side. Here they had come thousands of miles and were just feet away, but they were unable to touch them, unable to reach out or even hear what they had to say, knowing that if that ship left, they would most likely never see their loved ones again. The mood on the ship started to sour so deeply that they needed a suicide watch, as more than one passenger decided that was a better route than going back to Germany. In the end, there was nothing that could be done. They were forced to leave. Only they didn't know where to go. Captain Schroeder promised his passengers that he would do everything in his power to make sure that they didn't go back to Germany, but he didn't know where to take them. The passengers on board began to use whatever connections they had to cable ahead, to cable out there. They cabled the Secretary of State and President Roosevelt, even the mayor of St. Louis, praying that maybe that city which shared their ship's name, a good Christian name, would find it in his heart. They would find it in their heart to open their doors. But no one, that is, none of them, did. They tried Canada and were refused. And country by country, they failed. Until finally, they turned back to Europe. Aaron Posner and a few of the other passengers began to plan a mutiny. They said they'd rather be pirates than prisoners. The captain got word of it, and he promised them that he would do his best to make it okay, that he would do whatever was in his power to not return them to Germany. He told just a few that he had a plan. He was going to take them to the Sussex coast just off of England and set the ship on fire, knowing that then they would have to take their passengers. Or so he hoped. Fortunately, he never had to light the match. Just days before they were due to arrive, he received word from 4 countries in Europe, Belgium, Holland, France, and England, that they would accept his passengers. The passengers rejoiced, and they found their way to each of the ports to drop off whomever that group would take. And so he found himself in mid to late June, 40 days and 40 nights, exactly after he began dropping off his last passengers. Unfortunately, it was not enough to keep them safe. In the end, only the 288 passengers that had landed in England, with the exception of one lost in an air raid, were spared. Those who were on the mainland were not as lucky. Under the brutal Nazi occupation in the years ahead, they suffered the same fate as so many of their siblings. In the end, more than 254 of those passengers, men, women, and children, were killed. Never having found the life they so desperately sought. Every year on the week after Easter, we tell the story of Thomas, doubting Thomas, the one who failed to believe without seeing. Only we forget what he did see. Think of the story. Thomas steps into a room filled with people who claim to be disciples of Christ, people who claim to have just seen the risen Christ and been given a direct order, as the Father has sent me, so I send you. And there they are, just sitting there. A week later, they're sitting in the same place. If they really believed, wouldn't they live differently? If we really believed, would we? After World War II, the United States led an international effort to create new laws around asylum and refugees, to make sure that something like the SS St. Louis and those poor people who were turned away would never happen again. How quickly we forget. It's so easy for us to look back on Nazi Germany and to look down our noses at all of those who refused to allow the Jewish refugees in, to ask ourselves, how could they be so obtuse? But the truth is, friends, right now, while we wait to see who will win the Game of Thrones, there are men and women and children in deadly situations who are in search of life out in the world, the kind of life that we have to offer. Yes, it's complicated. Immigration and asylum and refugees, these are complicated things for nations to figure out. Nations have to have borders, and there has to be policy around them. We get it. A nation is under no obligation to welcome a refugee, but friends, Christians are. And it is not always that politics and religion are at loggerheads. But when they are, we have to choose. Will we lean on our faith or something else? 80 years ago, we failed to welcome refugees, and many died. What will we do today? If seeing is believing, friends, it starts with opening our eyes. As the Father has sent me, so I send you. Amen.